Hello watercolor lovers, welcome to my YouTube channel Watercolor Impressions. Since we are approaching end of summer, I thought a beach scene would be rather nice. This reference was taken at Wasaga Beach, a quite popular beach in Ontario. Check out the drawing template in the description below. When it comes to a beach scene, we have to simplify the scene what is in front of us. So before we get on to it, hit the subscribe button so you guys can get weekly updates from our channel. And let's get started, guys. As I said before, we have to simplify our scene. I also simplified the scene as well as the drawing. Check out the drawing template in the description below. So I'm starting with the sky wash. For the sky wash, I'm using Cobalt Blue. So I'm taking gradient from top to bottom. So as soon as it hits the horizon, I'm going to put in a little bit of Payne's gray in it so I know where the horizon is. So we could do the horizon in two ways. Either we can do it blurry or else we can do a dry brush stroke. Since it's wet, I added a little bit of Payne's gray where our horizon is. So once it dries out, it gives a beautiful illusion of distance. So I'm taking a thick pigment of French Ultramarine blue and a little bit of Payne's gray in my brush. I'm taking it all the way till the mid-crown. And I'm also making sure not to go over the umbrellas in the foreground as well. So you can also see I'm also going over the figures, so I'm just being aware of my brush strokes. Whenever you do the beach water, it's better to do the dry brush technique than a wet brush technique because it's always easy to control the dry brush than a wet brush technique. So once I am happy with my beach water, now let's focus on the foreground. So for the foreground, for the beach sand, I'm using raw amber, but I'm making sure that my value is super light because I want to create a glow in the foreground and a good lead in so that it takes us into the painting. So as it comes to the foreground, when it's coming close to us, I'll increase my pigment consistency. As you can see, there was a gradient happening from the midground to the foreground. Let's go ahead and finish the first wash on our scene. I'll throw some colors based on the reference. Sometimes I tend to change colors because we are sending visual clues to our viewer. So we want to make sure that our painting looks vibrant and pleasing to eyes. As you could see, we are creating a really bright red color in the foreground since that umbrella which sits in the foreground is our focal point. So for the other umbrellas, I'm going to keep it really light and weak, so I'm using Cobalt Blue for the umbrella in the foreground. So I have Cobalt Blue in my brush, so I'm throwing colors on the foreground here and there. So same thing for the umbrellas in the midground as well. So I want to keep it minimal so it doesn't read as strong as which is in the foreground. So now let's go and add some figures in our scene. For the figures, I usually go with raw amber with a little bit of Chinese white in it because I don't want to have a strong value. So for other figures, I tend to change color. So I use a little bit of burnt amber and sometimes I use cadmium orange and burnt amber together to have a darker pigment on our figures. So the figures who are on the shade, I'm using a little bit of darker value. So burnt amber and cadmium orange would do the trick because it also gives a little bit of variation in our figures as well. So I use the same technique and I filled in the figures and filled the dresses with different colors based on our reference. So the umbrella in the foreground is dried quite a bit, so I want to glaze over because since that's going to be a focal point, I'm going to be spending more time to getting the details and everything. And I also don't like the tight look, so as soon as I add the umbrella, it's kind of floating in the space, so I want to make sure that it anchors on our beach. So for the shadows, I used Payne's gray and a little bit of French Ultramarine blue so that there is coolness in our shadows. So since I have a darker value in my brush, so I'm adding in my umbrella. So this is just to tighten up the details in the foreground. It's the same kind of treatment we have to do at the hut. I don't know what it's called, so I'll call it a hut. And for that to anchor on the ground, I'm using Payne's gray and I'm creating marks here and there to have a darker value on other stuff. So whenever you add details, make sure to do a dry brush because it tends to maintain the values. It doesn't change or dry out a bit. So that's a strange thing about watercolors because once you add water, it tends to get lighter in values. So now let's jump on to add the shadows for other arts and people who are standing so that it anchors everybody on the ground. For the shadows in the foreground, I'm using French Ultramarine Blue and Payne's Gray. So I get a cooler shadow, a little bit of cooler shadow on the ground. Sometimes I also mix a little bit of yellow ochre in it to create a little bit of warmth in my shadow as well. So I'm taking the shadows and I'm bringing all the way from the foreground to the midground. So as I talked about the people in the hut, so I'm also making sure there's a shadow underneath it. So they are in the shadow, so they'll get a darker value in it. So since I have a darker value and Payne's Gray in my brush, so I'm just tightening up a little bit of details here and there, and I'm keep building it until I'm happy with it. So I'm also adding shadows for the people, and I'm also adding the chairs and poles and umbrellas and you name it. Now we are at almost at the end of our painting, and we're just about tightening up the look and adding some people. So I thought in the foreground it kind of a little bit weak, so I thought like a major figure would make this painting really good. So I'm adding his face with Payne's Gray, and I thought of having him giving a red shirt for him, since you know there's an umbrella, red umbrella on the foreground. So I did change my vision after I painted it, and I'm adding the shadow. So as soon as we added that figure, it kind of like created a story in our painting. Now I'm happy with my major figure, so now it's time to bring back highlights on our scene. So for bringing back highlights, I usually use sometimes gouache or Chinese white. So I'm starting from left to right, so I'm adding details for the people, for the person in the foreground. I'm also giving him a hat, so which kind of creates and bring him in the foreground as well. Our major figure in the foreground, he has like darker value for a sunny scene, so I want to have add a little bit of white paint on his shirt, so it kind of gives a lighter value for him, and it doesn't fight with our umbrella in the foreground as well. And I'm using white paint to give him a shorts so that you know he looks different, and he has more details because since he is our major figure. So now I'm tightening up the other look. And I wasn't happy with the umbrella in the midground because it was fighting with our beach as well. I wasn't happy with the major figure in the foreground, so I glazed over with the white paint, and I also created a really nice contrast between his shirt and his body. And after that I jumped on to adding some birds to get a floaty feeling in our sky. So after that I want to create a little bit of forms in my umbrella in the foreground, so there is a top part and the bottom part. So I glazed over with cadmium red. So I'm adding some marks here and there since I have a darker pigment in my brush, and I also felt that the sky looked really weak, so I'm glazing over with cobalt blue, and I'm not taking it all over till the horizon. I'm just making sure there's a gradient happening. And that's it folks, we're done. Thanks for watching this beach painting video and painting with me. Let me know what you learned from this video and what's your favorite color in this painting. If you have any other requests or subjects you want me to cover in watercolors, let me know in the comments or write me at watercolorimpressions@gmail.com. Thanks again for watching this tutorial. Please hit that subscribe button so you guys can get weekly video updates from our channel. And please do share with your friends and family. And good luck with your painting folks.